This is Dr. Stan, and certainly Dr. Cuddy is quoting from Edward Stettinius's papers, and basically, of course, one meeting where Stettinius was there, where certainly Stalin and FDR was there, and Stalin asked certainly President Roosevelt what concessions he might make to the Saudis. And of course, Roosevelt said, whether this is tongue-in-cheek but this is what he said, and Stettinius quotes him as saying, well, I think maybe I'll give the Saudi Arabians are 6 million Jews. We had about 6 million Jews in America at that time. He already knew that they'd already killed tens of millions, probably, close to 6 million Jews. And yet, of course, Roosevelt makes a joke or something like that. What sort of human being is that? What was the title of that book? Do you recall, Dennis?
Well, it's in Stettinius, his papers. I think you can find them at the University of Virginia, I think is where they're located. But it's, like these private papers of Colonel House that you came across at Yale and so forth. Well, Stettinius also had his memoirs, private papers. And in there, in Stettinius's papers, as Secretary of State, I suppose you could make a Freedom of Information request to the State Department if you wanted to. He wrote, and the date was referring to the Yalta meeting where Stalin was there and FDR was there, February 4th through 11th, 1945. And he's recording, what's going on. And he says the question that was asked, Stalin asked FDR if he intended to make any concessions to King Saud of Saudi Arabia, and Stettinius in his papers, his private papers as Secretary of State, said, quote, the president replied that there was only one concession he thought he might offer, and that was to give him the 6 million Jews in the United States, end quote. Well, that's very similar to the sort of remark that he made about Puerto Ricans. I remember I put this in my book, Now It's Dawning of the New Age, New World Order, which came out in 1991, where FDR is joking about zapping the Puerto Ricans and sterilizing them. He thinks that's real funny, too, he thinks. And so he makes these statements, and, in addition to that hypocritical Day of Infamy speech, here he is, FDR. They know the Japanese are coming. As I have mentioned many times before, but the book, The Globalist, that I wrote in the year, I believe it was 2000, how a Dutch officer named Reneft was in the naval headquarters in Hawaii, in Pearl Harbor, and he was looking at this big map, and he saw this tremendous concentration on the map of little ships. And he asked the naval officer what they were, and the naval officer just quite frankly told him, well, that's the Japanese fleet. Well, the thing was, this concentration of naval ships wasn't, near Tokyo. It was only 400 miles west of Pearl Harbor. So, what does he think? They took a wrong turn at Guam or something? Yeah, it's sort of obvious what the whole Japanese fleet is doing, just 400 miles away from Pearl Harbor.
And, of course, they wanted a war. They had to have an excuse for a war, and they had been tracking the Japanese fleet. We had already been at war with Japan. We'd put so many economic restrictions on them that they were running out of money. They couldn't buy oil anywhere in the world. Once they were out of oil, their whole economy shut down. And basically, of course, we wanted a war, and they knew the war was coming, and they left those boys there at Pearl Harbor to die. They left them at Pearl Harbor to die. Now, the only good thing that they did was they pulled the aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor so that they would not be destroyed, but they left our battleships there knowing that they would not be very effective in the coming war. But they wanted as many Americans to die as possible so then they would have a justification for getting into the war. It was all planned, ladies and gentlemen. They left them there to be slaughtered, just like suddenly they conceived of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, suddenly the sinking of the Lusitania, suddenly the attack on the World Trade Center, over and over and over again. They precipitate these incidents to get us into war, and there's a new war coming. It's not a matter of if, but when. Go right ahead.
Sure. You have the incident like the Maine blows up, and that gives them a justification, rationalization for going to war with Spain in 1898, and then the Lusitania in 1915. That didn't quite succeed, though. It took a little longer, and then Lord Esher, in his diary, talks about himself talking with Henry Morgenthau, was a big money supporter of Woodrow Wilson about how they needed to shed American blood as soon as possible. And so, as Dr. Stan said, you had a situation where ships like the Arizona weren't just left there, whereas aircraft carriers were removed. And there's a whole lot to that. I mean, Secretary of War Stimson, 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, writes about how he's just come out of a meeting with FDR where they're trying to see how they can maneuver the Japanese to firing the first shot. And so, they know what's coming. In my book, I believe it's Secret Records Revealed, I put an actual newspaper, the actual picture of the newspaper, front page of the Honolulu Advertiser. And this is a couple of weeks before Pearl Harbor, and the headline, a couple of weeks before Pearl Harbor, says Japanese expected to attack over weekend, like the upcoming weekend.
In fact, basically, I found when I went to Secretary of War Stimson's diary, the pages from his diary where he talked about, and it was November 21st, I think it was, or 25th. 25, and he basically says, I think that I had a meeting at the White House with President Roosevelt and 3 or 4 other people, and the president said, I think the attack is coming, attack at Pearl Harbor is coming. Suddenly, certainly before next Monday, and the only question is how we're going to get the Japanese to fire the first shot. Get us into the war and get the Japanese to fire the first shot. We make those available. You can get them from Radio Liberty, or certainly we probably should have them posted up on our pages. But we actually have those pages. It's real. They left those men there to die. Go right ahead.
Yeah, and of course the British know about all this too, because Sir Julian Huxley, who was the Fabian Colonial Bureau head for the Fabian Society, I think he was just got off a ship in New York City, and some reporters were around there, and they asked him what he thought the future would be, what was coming, and this was December 5, and he just frankly said, I think that America and Japan will be at war next week. And of course, 2 days later, Sunday, the first day of the next week, he was right. That was the first shot at Pearl Harbor.
And then, of course, everybody acts so surprised. Oh, my goodness, those terrible Japanese, the president, a surprise attack. It wasn't a surprise at all. They wanted the attack. They wanted men to die. So whatever justification for going to war. Go ahead.
Right. And, of course, General Marshall makes himself unavailable. So he's out there horseback riding, early in the day. So he's not available to be reached with any warnings that might come through from somewhere, from Washington or somebody who wasn't in on all this stuff. And so what you have is this sort of connection between all of these people. And it's not just Cecil Rhodes and his group. It's not just the Milner group executing his plan. There are other groups, like I said, the Fabian Socialists. They're aware of these things. Skull and Bones type people are into that because, for example, Stimson, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, was a member of Skull and Bones, and was also a Council of Foreign Relations member. And he was the one, Stimson, who initiated George H.W. Bush into that same Yale University Secret Society, Skull and Bones.
And let me just simply point out, ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, and Dr. Cuddy's 2 books on the power elite, you need to get them. But my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, explains about all these covert organizations. There's not one organization. There's a whole flock of them, but they're all bound together by this common hatred of America and this desire to bring about this one-world authoritarian government under a new ruling elite. That's what it's all about. And believe me, they're in total charge today. The subversives control Washington, D.C., and make mockery of our electoral process. Go right ahead.
Yeah, and Nasser, who I mentioned earlier, after World War II, Nasser, and he was also a leader of Young Egypt, just like Anwar Sadat. He was a leader of Young Egypt, which had hooked up with the Nazis. Nasser, there was a coup. It was July of 1952 against the monarchy in Egypt. And so he led that, and he became president in 1956, president of Egypt. And at first, the CIA indirectly, I guess you'd say, supported Nasser. They like to support various people, but only as long as the people are under their control. Like the CIA supported Gaddafi in late 1960s. They thought he would be a good leader we could work with. But if these leaders start acting a little too independently, then they have to be, have their wrists slapped or put down or removed. And so there's a book. It's titled The Game of Nations, and that's by a CIA agent in Egypt. His name was Miles Copeland. And in there, Copeland reveals the agency, the CIA, subcontracted more than 100 Nazi specialists in security and interrogation techniques to help Nasser. So here we are. We're working with Nasser originally. We have this secret Nazi plan that the power lead is in on, and the whole idea is to support these individuals and whether it's the Brotherhood and using them for our dirty tricks or whatever. And so initially that was the case, and then Nasser grew stronger, and CIA director at that time in the 50s was Alan Dulles, and after Nasser grew stronger, of course, the attitude changes. Alan Dulles sees Nasser as a threat who could ally Arabs and Muslims far beyond just the Egyptian national boundaries. And so Copeland, the author of that book I mentioned, said that Dulles told him, in other words, Dulles tells Copeland, quote, "If that Colonel Nasser of yours pushes us too far, we will break him in half," end quote. So here's a good example, an admission by somebody like Alan Dulles, an agent of the power lead, head of the CIA, an admission of what we do. If somebody we help or get into power starts acting too independently in ways we don't like, what Dulles said is, quote, "We will break him in half." And that's what they do. They make you, they break you. Well, the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, had originally supported Nasser. And there's a 1952 revolt I mentioned where Nasser comes to power. But they became also disenchanted with Nasser, just like the CIA did. They became disenchanted with him when it became apparent that he would not establish an Islamic State, because the Muslim Brotherhood that's one of their big points. We need to have Sharia law and a Muslim state. Of course, they found out that Nasser wasn't going to do that, establish an Islamic State. And the Brotherhood, were blamed for an assassination attempt on Nasser in 1954. And according to Copeland, interrogations of the Brotherhood members, they caught trying to perform that after the attempt revealed that they were merely a guild, quote unquote, that fulfilled the goals of a Western interest. So here again we have an acknowledgement that the West, Britain, the U.S., and so forth, are really behind a lot of these events, putting people into power, utilizing them, and if they try to act up or don't do what we want, gaining too much power, then they have to be, as Dulles said, break him in half. And so that's what they would do with these people. And another thing that Copeland said in that book, he said, quote, "Nor was that all. Sound beatings of the Muslim Brotherhood organizers who had been arrested revealed that the organization had been thoroughly penetrated at the top by," and I mentioned this before, the British, the American, Soviet intelligence services, and another one, the French as well, and any one of which could either make active use of the Brotherhood or blow it up, or whichever best suited his purposes. So that was the way Copeland, who had been an agent there, described what was going on. And on the book jacket for a book Dr. Stan has mentioned any number of times called The Devil's Game, subtitled How the United States Helped Unleash a Fundamentalist Islam, that's by Robert Dreyfus, you read the following. Now, this is on the book jacket of this book, The Devil's Game. Quote, "Among the hidden stories of U.S. collusion with radical Islam that Dreyfus, he's the author, reveals here are President Eisenhower's 1953 Oval Office meeting with a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the United States' later alliance with that group and their Saudi patrons against Egypt's President Nasser. Dreyfus meticulously documents CIA's funding of the Iranian Ayatollahs. They were funding the Iranian Ayatollahs, not just, Iraq and Egypt and so forth, but all over the place, Iran, the Ayatollahs. The CIA's funding of the Iranian Ayatollahs in the coup d'etat that restored Iran's Shah to power.